Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. When we last left the Duke and Duchess, they had made it to New Zealand and were very busy seeing a lot of enthusiastic crowds. They were both a hit, but Elizabeth even more so. She had a way of connecting with the crowd, and they felt she was looking right at them. When she got sick and couldn't go with the Duke was afraid he would have to cancel, but he decided to go on and found that he was as loved as Elizabeth was. So let's see what happens today. The Duchess was resting at a less luxurious commercial hotel in Nelson. After 3 days' rest, she was ready to sail in the Renown back to Wellington. She rested at the government house under the care of Commander White, and she met with Lady Alice Ferguson, the wife of the Governor-General. The Governor-General's wife had been ill and unable to receive the Duke and Duchess when they arrived in New Zealand, so the two of them recuperated in deck chairs in the sunshine. While they were separated, Elizabeth and her husband exchanged letters and told their feelings to each other. She said that everyone has been kind to her in Nelson. The baker sent bread, the bookseller books, the ladies cakes and flowers. She told him it was wonderful, but not quite enough. "I wanted a nice comforting kiss from you," she told him. And Elizabeth also said it was easier for them to work as a team, but she thought it was marvelous the way he carried on, and she told him she wasn't the focus of attention. The Duchess looked forward to the moment when they could see each other again, and she ended by saying, "I send you all my love and hundreds of kisses and several hugs." The Duke responded to her letter by saying, "My own little darling E, I have just received your darling letter, which has spurred me on to greater efforts. Millions and millions of thanks for it, darling. It's just what I wanted, and nothing could have given me greater help and encouragement." He said he missed her every day, but it was only a week and they would meet again. He said not to worry about him, but she should rest and her throat get strong again. The Duchess wrote to her sister May, and she said the program was ghastly, and she did it for 16 days and then cracked. She said it wasn't a suitable life for women, and they were having trouble to keep the Australian program down. She said, "They cannot believe we are made of flesh and blood, so if you see me coming home old and haggard and ugly, don't be surprised." The King, who was in London, was sympathetic and concerned. The real goal was Australia, and the Duchess had to get her strength back. He wrote the Duke that he hoped she would arrive in Australia quite fresh and well. "If you find she's getting tired, she must do less, otherwise she'll get ill again. You have certainly been through a strenuous time." The Duke and Duchess got back together on the Renown off Bluff, a desolate place on the southern tip of South Island. The weather was bad. The Duke was taken out to the ship in a harbor tug. In the squalls of wind and rain, his wife watched as he tried to board. Once they got on board, they set sail to Sydney. And there was no doubt that the tour of New Zealand had been a great success in spite of the Duchess's illness. They arrived there March the 26th, 1927. They put anchor down in front of the Admiralty House, and there was a great cheer from the crowd. The crowds in Australia were a little rougher than in New Zealand, including the press, and there was great humor, but less organization and less reverence. The Australians cheered loudly not only for the royal guests, but also for their little daughter. They referred to her as Princess Betty. The crowd called the Duke Albie. In Australia, they also didn't seem to take in the fatigue factor. The couple's staff tried to make sure their program wasn't overloaded. No one wanted the Duchess to get ill again. The first weekend, they attended a ball at the town hall, divine service at St. Andrew's Cathedral, and a garden party. They also took a tour of the Prince Wales Repatriation Hospital for the sick and disabled war veterans. The weather for the garden party wasn't great. The royal visitors and their hosts had to take tea under cover. They were watched by about 2,000 people standing in the rain. The Duke of York received an honorary degree from Sydney University, and at the same time the Duchess attended a large reception given in her honor by the National Women's Council. The children of New Wales presented her with a gold and silver tea set for Princess Betty. So the King was happy with the enthusiastic reception, which was reported in the British press. He wrote to his son, "I hope Elizabeth will not do too much and rest as soon as she feels she is getting tired. Your daughter is very flourishing and is more delightful every day and more pleasant with herself, and more pleased with herself." Queen Mary wrote to the Duke, "Baby is as sweet as ever. She is so lively and always trying to jump and stand up, and makes funny little noises and screams and shouts for fun, really too delightful, happy and carefree." She also said when they went to Windsor Castle, they were bringing with them in their car your adorable child, who was awfully good, giving shrieks of delight at each dog she saw. Dr. Still kept the Duchess informed of Elizabeth, too. He said in the early February that she was trying to stand on her nurse's lap. A month later, she was sitting up and was above average in height, and she had discovered how to roll over and over and how to wave goodbye and say ta-ta. By the end of March, she was growing fast, cutting more teeth, and could say bye. And she enjoyed listening to the band outside the palace. Okay, the purpose of the Duke and Duchess's trip was to open the new federal parliament, but they wanted to go to engagements at some of their patronages. The program reflected the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps and the soldiers who had fought the Great War. And they went northwards from Sydney towards Queensland and Brisbane, inspecting returned sailors, soldiers, nurses, Boy Scouts, and Girl Guides. The schedule was punishing, and they stopped at many places. The Duchess had many communications from soldiers who had stayed at Glamis to recuperate and officers who had been entertained at St. James Square during the war, and she made certain she could speak to as many people as possible. The Duke and Duchess reached Brisbane. They had been told to expect the capital of Queensland to be unsympathetic. It wasn't true. The crowds were enthusiastic. The crowds were huge, and the people were desperate to give the Duchess bouquets and presents. The Duchess said the people were so nice and friendly, and they had reached the middle of the tour and were looking forward to completing the second half. In Queensland, they were able to rest a few days on a cattle station named Tamarukum, and the weather was lovely, warm, with cool breezes. The Duke enjoyed gathering cattle, and the Duchess liked the grass, the trees, and the hills. She thought it was the prettiest place they had been to. The Duke told his father the people there had been the most wonderful spirit of loyalty to you and the Empire. Patrick Hodgkins wrote to Queen Mary that Her Royal Highness had captivated everyone with her charm of manner. Schoolgirls traveled hundreds of miles from the outback sheep stations to see her. Next, they parked in Tasmania. The weather was chilly, and they had a welcome at the capital in Hobart. The capital, it was affectionate but quieter than they had been in Brisbane or Sydney, and they got to rest at the sheep station of the Cameron family at Mona Vale. From Tasmania, the renown went to Melbourne, and the Duchess wrote the Queen. She told her she knew that she hadn't written in a while, but they'd been so busy, letters were extremely difficult to write. She confided that, "I think this sort of tour is far too strenuous for a woman," and she got terribly tired. She told Queen Mary that Bertie had been wonderful and is less shy and more sure of himself. When they got near Melbourne, the cruisers escorting the renown fired a 21-gun salute to mark the first birthday of Princess Elizabeth. The Duke and Duchess missed their daughter terribly, and they sent her a telegram. At Windsor, Queen Mary wrote in her diary, April 21st, "Beautiful day, darling baby's first birthday. We gave her lots of presents after breakfast. The King recorded that they gave her a jeweled safety pin brooch, frocks, and toys, and she gazed at everything and beamed. I think rather liked it all." The next day, the Duke and Duchess received a telegram. "I sent you my best love on my first birthday, and thank you for the telegram. Wish you were here with me. I have lots of lovely presents. Hope to see you very soon. Little Elizabeth." The doctor sent the Duke and Duchess a report on Elizabeth, saying she now weighed 23 pounds. "You will be delighted with her. She is so sweet, and it's not merely sweet looks, but a sweet nature that makes her such a darling." But he mentioned that she could proceed to battery and assault on a nurse when things were not as she required. "Thinking you are not allowed to come to me today, you will have to come home and do the stern mother." Her vocabulary was growing, and she pointed to the electric light and said, "Yite." So Melbourne was prepared for the meeting, and when the royal couple stepped ashore, they were welcomed by a large number of school children singing the national anthem and waving. The Duchess was pleased and kept waving at them, and according to the Argus, she was wearing a small blue hat with a large cluster of blue velvet forget-me-nots, which drooped over the brim of one side, and these exactly matched her blue eyes. The paper said she was petite and slender, with rose-petal skin and grace and charm. It mentioned her smile, and the strange thing is that everyone who has seen it feels it's for him or her alone. It seems to create an intimacy which, while purely imaginary, is nonetheless delightful. They drove in a horse-drawn carriage down the processional route of St. Kilda's Avenue in the city. Just as they were about to enter the federal government house, the wingtips of two airplanes and their Royal Australian Air Force escort touched, and the planes crashed killing the crews in front of their eyes. The Duchess was very upset, and she continued with the program for the next 2 days, but Commander White felt she should spend the weekend resting at the government house, and the Duke sent a message of heartfelt sympathy. 3 days later, on April 25th, came Anzac Day. It showed the sacrifice in Flanders, Palestine, and Gallipoli. Thousands of people from all over Victoria poured into Melbourne to see the salute taken by the Sun Monarch, in whose name those sacrifices had been made. The Duke laid a wreath on the cenotaph in front of the Parliament House. The Duke joined the Governor-General and the Governor of the saluting base, and then the renowned Marine Band led the parade, followed by Australia's most distinguished officer, General Sir John Monash, and his staff. Then 25,000 men from all over Australia and New Zealand marched past, almost all in plain clothes, but wearing all their medals, including all 29 recipients of the Victoria Cross. May 8th, the Duke and Duchess traveled in a procession of carriages to the Parliament House. The Duke had slept badly and was nervous, because this was going to be a momentous occasion for the Commonwealth, for the Crown, and for himself. The Duke inspected the Guard of the Honour, and then was presented with a golden key by the Australian Prime Minister Stanley Bruce, and invited to unlock the door of the new building. He then spoke on the steps to the crowd outside, and many thought it was his most moving speech he made in the whole tour. Dom Nellie Melba sang "God Save the King," and the procession entered the Parliament House. They formally unveiled the statue of King George V in the King's Hall, and the Duke sat in the chair of the President of the Senate, with the Duchess nearby. The journey was almost done, and from Canberra they returned to Melbourne to rejoin the Renown. They made the last part of the journey in open cars and stopped at the town halls in South Melbourne to say goodbye. The last destination, Fremantle, in the principal port in Western Australia, they had the same effects on the crowds. Then they headed for home on the Renown, and one man who had been in the crowd wrote the Duchess to say he heard a 12-year-old schoolboy say, "She looked at me, and I got a smile too. I could judge by the tone in his voice you had won his little heart." On the ship, the Duke had time to start a long letter to his father. He was relieved that his speeches had gone off without a hitch. He gave credit to Lionel Logue, and he said it was a relief to have the mission over, and I played my part successfully. Elizabeth, he said, had done wonders, and though I know she's tired, she never had a return of tonsillitis, and went about with me every day. He said I could have never done the tour without her help. That I know, and I'm so thankful she came too. Both his parents wrote to the Duke. Queen Mary said, "We have had such delightful letters from various people about the tour, telling us of you and E's popularity, and of the trouble you both gave yourselves to make the tour the success it's been." Well, the Duke and the Duchess were on the Indian Ocean 3 days on the Renown when a serious fire broke out in the Renown's engine room. It was caused by an overflow of fuel oil between the tanks, and the engine room became an inferno, and 4 of the boiler room staff were gassed and burned as they tried to put out the flame. There was a risk that the ship's principal oil tanks could explode, and that would have destroyed the ship, and they had plans to abandon the ship, but the firefighters, after 8 hours, put out the flames. Years later, Queen Elizabeth recalled that the nearest ship was 1,000 miles away, totally empty sea. She said we were prepared to leave, and the deck got quite hot, and she couldn't think of anything to take in the boat except a bottle of Malverin water and my book of prayers. I couldn't leave them behind. When they got near home, the Duchess wrote to the King to say how much they were looking forward to seeing him and the Queen again. She said, "I hope you will not think me looking old and ugly, but a week in the Red Sea in June doesn't help the complexion to look its best. It has been very hot, and my cabin sleeping has been 105, which is most uncomfortable. I am looking forward more than I could say to the baby and a good rest. I have missed her all day and every day, but I am so grateful to you and Mamma for having been so kind to her. It will be wonderful to see her again. With much love, dearest Papa, ever your affectionate daughter-in-law, Elizabeth." So I'll end the video here. And what a trip the Duke and Duchess had with all the traveling they did. And they had a lot on their shoulders to represent the Crown and the British Empire. And they were very successful at it. It must have been a great feeling to have accomplished what they set out to do. Regardless of the setbacks with Elizabeth's health, she rallied and was by her husband's side, and the Duke was grateful for her being with him. They got to see the people of New Zealand and Australia and how patriotic they were, and how excited they were to see the Duke and Duchess. So in the next episode, we'll see what happens once they get back to England. I hope you liked the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. So I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.